and he's going to go about business as usual. But you have to understand some piece of history at this time. This is a very tumultuous time all throughout Europe. They're having wars everywhere. The Moors, the Catholics, the Protestants, all fighting each other for power and territory. Not in the name of God, but for power and territory. And Charles is having its own civil war eruptions throughout Great Britain because he's not keeping his promises. But Charles is collecting their taxes now and telling the people, we need more tax dollars because we've got to fund our allies in these foreign wars. Because if we don't fund our allies in these foreign wars, then our enemies will be on our doorstep. So the people are helping him fund these foreign wars, but remember, they're having this is an enormous awakening that they're getting here during the reign of Charles. And they start watching Charles very, very closely, and they're noticing that Charles is really talking out of both sides of his mouth. He's telling them we must support and fund our allies, but he's actually funding their enemies. Because the enemies have promised to help Charles with his civil war problems. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death, bringing the fourth document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. This is the most amazing document. I mean, these people have really, really gotten it. They say, the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design to subvert the fundamental liberties that are firmly established in this kingdom. They said, it's a design. We've been watching tyrants now for 600 years, and we're noticing a pattern here. Tyrants using the same bag of tricks over and over again, and the only purpose of these tricks is to overturn and undermine liberty. The malignant and pernicious design. Are you ready? Corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, diminishing property rights of the people, the government inserting itself into the church, manipulation of the monetary systems, and disarming the people while the government stayed armed. Do you still think we're more intellectually advanced than we were in 1641? Have you heard of a principle called Agenda 21?
Yes.
Sustainable development. Would you be interested in knowing that the United Nations did not invent sustainable development? Charles I was engaged in sustainable development. Go read the Grand Remonstrance and you'll see several provisions, several complaints against Charles that match right up with Agenda 21, but you will hit one. It's actually two, but it's like a continuing thought. Charles was taking the private land from the landowners and creating the king's preserves in the name of resource preservation and, I quote, depopulation. So, if in 1641 we had this malignant and pernicious design firmly established, what's happened in the last 370 plus years? Now, this is not going to be the last time our fathers had to fight for liberty, because in about 40 years, James II is going to take the throne. James II is on his second wife, who is an Italian princess. And when he marries her, she brings over foreign law. James begins engaging in the malignant and pernicious design, the entire thing. James commits the same error that John did. He tries to write this law that's supposed to look like it's going to give the people of Great Britain religious liberty. But it's not. It actually requires them. It says, okay, the religious liberty part was this. You no longer have to go to church. You can now have church in your homes. You can have church anywhere you like. But when you do that, you are promising to let us know when you're meeting, where you're meeting, and what you're going to be talking about, and you will promise to never, ever, ever say anything bad about the king. And then he required the churches to read this in their congregations on 2 Sunday services. 7 bishops refused. They petitioned the king of their grievances and said, "We are guaranteed that you are not to be in our church. There's a promise that you have to live up to." James arrested them, charged them with a crime of seditious libel, which said it's against the law to disagree with the king. Punishable by life in prison, which is death for them. Not only that, you get your habeas corpus because he learned from Charles that if you don't give him habeas corpus, they'll chop off your head. So you get your habeas corpus, but in seditious libel, truth is no defense. So even if you're right, you're wrong, and you get to die. 7 ministers who had petitioned the king, been charged with seditious libel, and by the law should have been found guilty because there is no defense, were acquitted because the judges refused to follow the unconstitutional law and the people refused to enforce it. And a revolution is born. The glorious revolution of 1688. Anybody ever hear that one? The glorious revolution of 1688 is so important to us because it gives us the 5th document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. A list of grievances against James II on how he's violated the Grand Remonstrance, the Petition of Right, the Magna Carta, and broken the promise in the 1100 Charter of Liberties and engaged in the malignant and pernicious design. This document says, whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil counselors, judges, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of this kingdom. Now that word subvert means to overturn and undermine. That was in the Grand Remonstrance, but they've added another criteria here, extirpate. Now I had to look it up. We don't use it very much. That word extirpate means to completely destroy. If you completely destroy something, is there anything left? No. So what they're saying is what James was doing was completely destroying liberty. Now I'm not going to read you the whole list. I think I can just read one and you'll get the gist of this. It says that James was completely destroying liberty by assuming and exercising a power of dispensing with and suspending laws and the execution of laws without the consent of Parliament. Because you see, in 1688 they had separation of powers. We didn't invent that, we inherited it. They had a judicial branch, they had a legislative branch in Parliament, and they had an executive branch in the king. And they said when the executive branch is writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that is the sole duty and responsibility of the legislative branch, that the executive branch is completely destroying liberty. How is it that in 1689 they could identify executive orders as the complete destruction of liberty, and yet our Congress today has no argument? Now this document is important because this is the document that our framers carried with them when they came to these colonies as proud British citizens. Because you see, I ask students who fought in the Revolutionary War, and they tell me the Americans and the British. The problem is there were no Americans in the Revolutionary War. They were Americans by geography, but by nationality, they were proud British citizens. After all, if they weren't British, why in heaven's name did we file a Declaration of Independence from Great Britain? And they brought with them the 5 documents and the 700 years of history. So when George III begins engaging in the malignant and pernicious design, because the Boston Tea Party was not about taxes, you've been taught wrong. It was not the Sons of Liberty screaming, "We've been taxed enough already." It was the Sons of Liberty screaming, "We've been tyrannized enough already." You have to read the Declaration of Independence. You will see that you have to go all the way to the 17th grievance before you even get to anything about taxes. Because the interesting thing about Georgia's taxes were, they weren't simply taxes, they were mandated purchases. You see, they were consumption taxes. So in order for the government to maximize their revenue from these consumption taxes, they made it illegal for you to purchase anything that they did not approve, that they could not tax. Tea, sugar, linen, lumber, paper. If you made your own linen, you were a criminal because you were avoiding the consumption tax. And if you were a criminal, you could have your home searched without a warrant in these silly, nasty little things called writs of assistance. And then you were arrested and then transported to Canada to be tried by the French. That's what the revolution was really about. See, the Boston Tea Party throwing the East India Tea Company tea into the harbor was not by random accident. It was on purpose because the East India Trading Company tea was the government-mandated tea. So, do you think that maybe the framers of this nation might have a little insight on what's going on here today? Did you learn something this evening?
Yes.
What you learned, do you believe that it's essential to the preservation and proper application of this Constitution?
Yes.
So why do you only have one representative here? You see, when I was in undergraduate school, I worked my way through undergraduate school for a little while as a plumber. The master plumber would not let me touch a toilet until he was certain that I had the proper training and expertise to get the job done right. So why did I have to have more training to touch a toilet than your representatives have to touch your liberty? Do we really believe that when they get elected, some great white dove of knowledge lands on their head and imparts them with all the constitutional wisdom they're going to need? Don't let them lie to you and say, well, I went to law school and therefore I know the Constitution, because that's a big fat lie. Law schools don't teach the Constitution. They teach constitutional law, which is worse than teaching nothing at all. Because constitutional law teaches your lawyers, who will become your judges, who will become your Supreme Court justices, that men and women in black robes know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. I teach a presentation on state sovereignty on the 9th and 10th Amendments. It's about an hour and 20-minute PowerPoint, and I show you how the Supreme Court has lost its brain. Marbury versus Madison, they declared themselves the supreme rulers of the universe, and we lost liberty. So I'm just asking you, and I'll ask you what Daniel Webster asked his people in 1806, July 4th, 1806, by the way. He said, is our Constitution worth preserving? Is our Constitution worth preserving?
Yes.
Yes.
He said, then guard it as you would the very seed of your life. He said, guard it not only against the open blows of violence. Now again, I'm not making this up. This is a direct quote. Guard it not only against the open blows of violence, but also against that seed of change. Miracles do not cluster. That which has happened but once in 6,000 years may never happen again. And such a government, once destroyed, would leave a void to be filled, he said, perhaps with centuries of riot and tumult, despotism and revolution. People ask me all the time, how do you manage to keep up your schedule? How do you do what you do? Because I do travel a lot, I do teach a lot, and everything that I do is I do for free. I don't charge a dime. I don't even require transportation or lodging. This is a ministry because I believe this is my reasonable service in my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor. And they say, how do you do this? And I say, I have the best motivation anyone could ever have. I have a 7-year-old. And I have to look in his eyes and try to figure out how to explain to him how a generation of people thought flat screen TVs and cell phones and vacations and happy meals were more important than freedom of religion and freedom of speech and the right to bear arms and the right to be free from unreasonable government intrusion. And I've decided that I'm not going to get to the end of my road and have to make excuses for myself. Because you see, liberty is unique. It is something that you do not purchase for yourself. Your fathers have purchased your liberty that you enjoy. We are the ones that must purchase it, as our framer said, for ages and millions yet unborn. If we do nothing now, we do not suffer. We might be inconvenienced, we might, it might get to the point where we stand in line for food like they did in Russia. But we will not suffer the greatest consequences of tyranny. But we will force our children to suffer that fate. Sam Adams said, when we tamely suffer a lawless attack on liberty, we encourage it. Because you see, doing nothing is not doing nothing. Just going to Tea Party meetings is not just doing nothing. Just complaining in your newspaper is not just doing nothing. Doing nothing is actually being a cheerleader for tyranny. Because if you just sit back and do nothing, then you're actually encouraging it, Sam Adams said. And he said it's a serious consequence to consider that ages and millions yet unborn will be the miserable sharers of our experience. We might just be the first generation that fails to pass on what we inherited. Not even something better, but something worse. But we still have time, because we are not a kingdom, we are a republic. If we were a kingdom, our only solution would be revolution and chopping off the king's head. But we are a republic. We have solutions inherent in our representation, inherent in the 10th Amendment and state sovereignty. Your state representatives should be right now sending resolutions to Washington, D.C. and telling them, we will not comply with any unconstitutional laws. We will no longer enforce any provisions by the EPA. We will no longer enforce any provisions by the Department of Education. We will no longer allow the Department of Homeland Security in our states. We will no longer allow these unconstitutional agencies to steal the power that belongs to the states and force our people into tyranny. And if your state legislators won't, you better have a sheriff that will. We have a sheriff in Florida, in Liberty County, Florida, who stood up and said, I'm sorry, I'm not enforcing conceal and carry permits because they are unconstitutional. Your right to bear arms says it shall not be infringed. And it's absolutely ludicrous that you would have to ask permission of the very government that you're arming yourself against. It is stupid, and it is unconstitutional. And this sheriff said, I'm not going to enforce these laws. And our governor, Rick Scott, had him arrested, removed him from office, and replaced him with a Florida Department law enforcement agent. We're having a rally for him tomorrow, by the way. And we're standing by him. Because if you don't stand by your sheriffs, there won't be anybody to stand for you, except you and your 22 in the front yard.
The sheriff is the highest elected law enforcement officer in the country.
Absolutely. In your
All the federal
jurisdiction,
government agencies are appointed.
In your jurisdiction, your sheriff is more powerful than the President of the United States. More powerful than any elected official. No one has power in your jurisdiction greater than your sheriff. The sad thing is fewer people show up to elect your sheriff than they do the president. So let me ask you something. Is the Constitution worth preserving?
Yes.
Then it's about time we stop electing people who know nothing about it and start electing people who are willing to be trained. Now, I teach a 5-hour workshop. I'm planning to come back to Minnesota. Would you like your leaders to arrange to have me teach this 5-hour workshop in your area?
Absolutely.
Now, this isn't a catch. I don't charge anything for those either. All I ask is that you bring your elected people to these workshops. And when I mean your county commissioners, your city councilmen, your school board members, your sheriff, your deputies, your police chief, your representatives, your attorney general, if you can. Don't worry about it. Pam Bondi's my attorney general, and she's no better than yours. So she's filed She has filed appellate briefs to have the courts determine that law enforcement agents can see a person carry a gun and automatically assume that they're a criminal. Meaning, if you carry a gun, you are guilty until proven innocent. Not only that, she has filed appellate briefs to have the courts determine that our Florida law enforcement agents have the right to search your cell phones, your iPads, and your computers with no warrant at all.
Evil and oppressive.
And yet she's on Fox, and she's supposed to be a hero. Well, look, I have books back there. This is how I fund the ministry. That and donations and prayer. What I have back there is this book, Not a Living, Breathing Document. This is the easiest way for you to take the lesson that I just taught you today. If you could not take notes, this is this lesson, this 700 years in the genealogy of the Constitution. I also have 2 student books that teach the history that I just taught you, so that you can teach your children what they're not learning in any school anywhere else. Because if we don't start teaching our children the truth, the government schools are teaching them that the enemy is our friend. And when it comes time for them to take over this country, they're not going to know the difference. This blue book is called Bedtime Stories. It's for non-readers. It's in color. And every chapter has a poem in it that acts like a memory verse. So